Hello and welcome back, it's Chris here. So since the last vlog, we have completed our first development sprint. We've started the second one. I've redesigned the way that the app looks, and I know that ordering is a little bit sketch, but I've learned so much along the way. I want to share all of those lessons learned with you in this vlog. But before I do that, in case you're new here, this is a raw and unscripted video format where I share our team's journey in making money with apps. This vlog entry is dated January 25th, 2024. So with that being said, I hope you enjoyed today's vlog. All right, since the last video update, we've finished our first development sprint. That was here, Sprint Acorn. I'll talk about that in just a second, but just to take a couple steps back in case you're brand new here, because we're into vlog 6 now. The original idea was a mood tracker app that I sketched out in my notebook, and then we designed it into a flow that looked like this. And then we decided to take the first very simple core user flow, which is to make a entry and to look at your logged entries and look at a calendar view, and turn that into a series of tasks to complete. Then we estimated each of the tasks in terms of something called story points, which is a rating of how complex it is and an approximation of how long it would take. After breaking down the tasks and estimating them, we decided to work in 2-week sprints. Now for the first sprint, we only actually had about a week and a half because of other priorities. And we had 2 developers on this project, which are Iñaki and Joash. So we assigned the tasks to them in this first sprint. At the end of the 2 weeks or week and a half, we had a demo of what they were working on. And then we had a retrospective where we talked about what went well and what we could improve on. And then we had something called the backlog grooming step, which is to take a look at the status of the project, what's been done, what's not been done, and reorganize things for the next sprint, which is this one, Sprint Baklava. So first of all, let's talk about what went well and what didn't. So what went well was they were really excited to work on a new project because it's been a while since we have built our own stuff. And so they were really excited to do that. But let me touch on some of the things where we could improve on. One was misestimation of the story points. So what we wanted to get done in the first sprint, it ended up being too much in reality to do. So I would say we got done maybe half of what we had set out to do in the first sprint. So we had really underestimated the amount of time and effort it would take to do the tasks. There were also unforeseen dependencies because you have 2 people working with each other. One person might get stuck on their task because they're relying on a piece that someone else is doing. So Joash says the same thing here, didn't anticipate for some other dependencies. And the UI. So they were working off of this UI here that we had designed. Now, the problem is that me as the project owner, I didn't feel like this design was final, but yet I got the guys to start on this anyways. So that is a bit of a problem because they're building off of something that may change. And so that became very apparent as a huge detriment after this first sprint because they weren't able to build finalized UI. And when I was looking at the demos, there were also there were assumptions that were made that weren't very clear. For example, let me just put this into concrete terms here. Let me see if I can find. Okay, so for example, this screen right here, where you're supposed to be able to scroll through your moods for that day. Now, it's not clear looking at this timeline, this little strip on this side, where are you supposed to see timestamps? Right? So when Iñaki was building this, to him, he interpreted this design as, okay, you see the starting time, like the timestamp of the first entry and the timestamp of the last entry. And so he was trying to build that and he was running into difficulty because he was implementing this as a list and he needed to make sure the lines connected and all of that. But when I look at this design, I interpreted this as you thinking about what would be useful for a user. I would think there's a timestamp beside every entry. And then the lines just connect all the timestamps together. So that is what became apparent, this sort of miscommunication where this isn't spelled out, that sort of stuff. And this was so easy to overlook when you're looking at a design. You're like, oh yeah, this looks good. I see that there's a line here, but it's not until you actually try to build it out that these questions come to mind. And one thing I think we could do better is to make sure that every aspect of the user interface is thought out and all the what ifs are answered before we start development. So that's something that I'm definitely taking into the next sprint. So in this next sprint, we had most of the tasks, to be honest, from the first sprint were not done. So they were moved into the second sprint here. So they were continuing to work on like the mood entry and the scrollable calendar, things like that. But while they were working on that, I decided that I really needed to finalize this design so that Iñaki and Joash could work off of something more final and that things weren't up in the air. So I did this exercise, which actually worked out really well. So I think in my head, I couldn't put my finger on why I wasn't happy with design because I don't think it was how I imagined the app. So it needed to come from me to drive that direction. And I was imagining a mood tracker being very calm. I wanted also the theme to be simple. So with the focus on that, I took an image that I found calm and soothing, which is this one. And I took the colors from it and I decided to use that as a starting point for my design. And I'm not a professional designer. I wanted to put something down to give direction to JC, who is our designer, to really put the finishing touches and the details together. But I wanted to start him off to give him a sense of where my head was at. So this is what I started creating, and I want to take you through the process of how I arrived closer and closer to a final design. So this was what I did first. I started with this screen, and I wanted to make it very simple. Instead of overwhelming the user with options, I wanted to just ask a simple question. Are you leaning more towards the bad side or the good side? And after you make a selection for bad and good, then we begin to drill down and ask more questions. But if you don't want to, you can just hit save and then you just feel good or bad, right? Because sometimes you're not in the mood to enter more details. But if you are, then you can. So I imagine there to be a library of preset. Let's say you selected good. So a preset of good emotions here or moods. You'd be able to type in a custom one. These are your recent ones, and these are pinned ones if you use often. And this is a scrollable section right here. And then I imagined when you selected something, it would come down here into this little area. And then we would ask additional questions like weather. Obviously, these options don't make sense for weather, but I just wanted to give the gist of it rather than designing it for real. So then the next question is, are you with anyone? What activity were you doing? And things like that. Because the more detail that you log now, in the future, when you look back on it and you're trying to analyze how you feel and what sorts of triggers you have and all that stuff, the more data you have, the better. So that was my first attempt at that. The second attempt, I thought of, instead of, like, I wanted to indicate where you were along that path of logging a full emotion or a full entry. So I decided to use these icons to represent the different questions. But as I was doing it, as I got to this step, I scrapped this idea because to me, looking at this, it didn't fit the ethos of being simple. Like when I look at this, it actually makes me anxious that I have to answer so many different questions. But what this does do well is it allows you to jump back. Let's say you're at this point and you want to change an answer from a previous screen. You can tap on something to jump back to that section. So that was my second iteration, but I didn't like how cluttered and how overwhelming it looked. And decided then to start working on how the entry screen might work. And I wanted to carry through that cozy and calm feeling. So it really helped to have a color palette. And these colors I picked out from this photo right here. So I really used all of these colors except green. I couldn't find a good place to use green until I got here. And I decided I actually needed a couple of other colors as well. So I wanted to weave your entry into a sentence. So it looked like this. So from there, at that point on, I knew I was onto an idea. So I decided to formalize it a little bit by charting out the main screens and the logging flow. This gray box is the onboarding, which I haven't done yet. And the other thing I thought through was how these screens get presented. So I wrote here that this is an initial screen. When the app is launched, this is the first screen they see, because let's say you are in the mood to log into Motion, right? You launch the app. That's what you probably typically want to do, is like you're launching the app to log into Motion. So I wanted to pop this up first as the initial screen. If it's the very first time you're ever launching the app, we should show an onboarding sequence that tells you a little bit about the app first. But aside from that, subsequent launches would show this screen on app launch. And I wanted this to be a sheet, a popover sheet, so that it can be dismissed by the user dragging down on it. And if you select a mood and you go forward with logging an entry, then you go into this logging flow, which I showed you a little bit about, and you can cancel out of it at any time, and you can hit confirm at any time. So I made sure to add a lot of notes as I was designing this, because I wanted to capture all of my thoughts as well on what happens when a certain button is tapped and what screen should it go to. So for example, when you tap on this X button, at this point in time, you've already made a selection, which is you've selected bad or good. So you've started an entry, right? In that case, we shouldn't just discard it. When you hit X, I want to show a dialog that says discard or continue. And then same thing here, you see a check mark to save. If you don't want to continue answering all these different questions, you can hit this to save at any time and go back to the entries screen. At this point, when you hit X, they haven't actually made any data entry. There's no data entry here. So if you hit X, we don't need to show a confirmation dialog. We just dismiss it. And there's no save button here because they haven't actually made any selections yet. So in both of those cases, whether they dismiss this pop-up or they save the entry, they will come down here. And I decided to organize it by day because I realized that I need to show that a certain day has no entries. And I realized this when I thought about the calendar view. So this is the calendar view. It shows the calendar view as a full screen sheet. So again, it slides up and it looks like this. And if there's a circle over it, that means there are entries for that day. And this little dot represents the current day. I modeled this calendar off of the calendar app in iOS. So what happens when you select a certain day? It goes to the entries screen, scrolled to that date. So that's why, let's say you hit 11 of January and it would go here and it would show you 11th of January with no entries. If I didn't show these dates with this no entry label, then where would you scroll to? It wouldn't really make sense. And other things that are really helpful to add these little comments are like a to-do, things that I haven't thought through yet. So for example, how do you edit or delete an entry? Right, so I just left a little note there for myself. And something I thought about for V2 was to add a filter button. If you tap on this button, we should be able to filter. Show me all of the entries where I felt good. Show me all of the entries where I felt happy or whatever. And that would allow you to do that. I thought through this scrolling mechanism would allow you to scroll through different days, but you would soon get lost. So this button allows you to go back to the current day. And this white button here brings up the new mood entry screen. Like it would slide up this screen right here and allow you to log into Motion. That's what that button does. And this would lead you to a profile screen as a sheet as well. So I haven't designed this either. But as you can see, the entries, this is the main view, but the profile is a slide up full screen sheet. The new entry is a slide up full screen sheet, and the calendar is as well. So I think it's much simpler, especially this screen with the entry. And it's only if you select one of these options where you go into a deeper logging flow And at any time you can exit and stop answering questions by hitting this save button. Now, there are certain interactions that I've identified here that I haven't really thought through yet. For example, how do you edit a custom emotion or mood that you've added? Let's say you made a typo, because I imagine when you tap on this to add a custom mood, that the keyboard would pop up and you'd type it directly into here. And then if you hit enter, it would turn into a bubble here that you can select. So how would you edit that or delete one of the ones that you added yourself? Would it be a tap and hold interaction? But if it is a tap and hold interaction, how would that be discoverable? Because it's really hard to see that you would be able to tap and hold this to bring up some options. So you have to think about that discoverability. Aside from just maybe literally putting a label here that says you can tap and hold these little bubbles, you could do that, but ideally you would make it more of a discoverability thing. Now, the other question that I got asked when I showed this to Iñaki and Joash, and it's a really good observation, is that when you tap on one of these, does it go to the next screen automatically, or does it just select it? And it would show a selected state, and then you'd have to tap on some sort of button to go to the next screen. Another thing that was brought up was that if you are on the next screen, how would you go backwards to, let's say, change your answer? So those are things that I still need to think about and we still need to solve. And the reason why this X button, there's like overlap here, is because this X button was added after the fact when we were in a meeting. So I haven't gotten a chance to adjust that. But it's a work in progress, but I'm a lot happier with the general direction of this versus this, where I gave this to our designer and I literally gave JC this. Like these images, these doodles right here, and he came up with this. So I realized that it's even for you, if you have an app idea and you are going to send it off to a designer, people can't read your mind. Now, you probably have some sort of idea of how you want it to look like, the colors, like even some sort of ethos, like simplicity is the one that I decided to use here, right? Even something like that would be something to go on for a designer. So I think JC would be able to take this and develop it further, because I think there's enough indication of the direction I want to go in. And furthermore, I don't want this direction to just be for this app, because if you go back to vlog number 1, you'll know that this is going to be a series of health and wellness and productivity type apps. I really want to carry this theme across all of the family of apps so that they're cohesive. And the other thing is that I know this color scheme isn't for everyone. I find this soothing. Everyone's different. I do plan to allow like color theme changes. That's something that I put on the backlog, and I think it would be a nice thing to have as well. Now, all of this stuff that I'm talking about here, this new design direction, I did this while Sprint Baklava was underway. So Joash and Iñaki are not working off of this new design yet. So at the end of Sprint Baklava, we have to re-estimate some of the things based on this new design. And then we are going to plan sprint number 3. And then we'll be working off of the new design. So I want to say that going through this process so far, working with other people has been really eye-opening, actually. Some of the things that have come up, for example, making sure, like, how do you communicate what's in your head to someone else? Making sure that you have things finalized and well thought out before you hand it off. And then also, like, how do you properly estimate things? All of those have come up as road bumps in the journey. So lots of learnings. I'm really glad that I'm going through this process, and I hope that you're having some takeaways as well just by following along.